Hi there, and welcome back to LeanReads, the channel where we share powerful insights and personal growth lessons through great books. I used to think capitalism was simply about markets, money, and growth. But after reading this book, I realized it's about morality, belonging, and purpose. In this video, I'll share the most eye-opening ideas from the future of capitalism and why it might just change how you see the world. If you enjoy what you hear and want to dive deeper, we've included a link to the book in the description below. Now, let's get started. Published in 2018, The Future of Capitalism by Paul Collier is a powerful wake-up call to the modern Western world. It argues that capitalism, once the engine of progress, has lost its moral compass, leaving societies divided, anxious, and uncertain about the future. Collier doesn't reject capitalism itself. Instead, he asks a deeper question. What happens when a system designed to create prosperity begins to tear the social fabric apart? He believes that while globalization and technology were meant to lift everyone, they have instead enriched small, highly educated elite clustered in major cities, while vast groups of working people have been left behind. The result is a two-speed society, one group racing ahead in the global economy, the other feeling abandoned, resentful, and stripped of purpose. This widening divide has fueled populism, nationalism, and distrust in democratic institutions, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom. Yet Collier insists that collapse is not inevitable. The solution, he says, lies in rebuilding a shared moral foundation, a new hard center that rises above left-right politics, grounded not in ideology, but in mutual obligation, fairness, and civic responsibility. Paul Collier is one of Britain's most respected economists and a professor of economics and public policy at the University of Oxford. He served as director of research at the World Bank and has advised numerous governments and international organizations, including the UN and the OECD. Collier's earlier works, The Bottom Billion, 2007, and Exodus, 2013, made him one of the most influential voices on global poverty and migration. With The Future of Capitalism, he turns his analytical lens inward, examining the moral and political fractures within the very societies that once shaped modern capitalism. For centuries, capitalism has been the most successful engine for human progress. But today, it faces a profound crisis of legitimacy. Collier argues that humans are not driven solely by self-interest. We also crave belonging, purpose, and respect. When extreme individualism replaces shared moral norms, communities crumble, and capitalism loses its soul. He calls for a reformation of capitalism, not its destruction. That means businesses must serve society, not just shareholders. Governments must restore fairness and opportunity, and individuals must rediscover a sense of mutual responsibility, the moral glue that binds society together. Only by combining economic efficiency with social compassion, Collier argues, can we rebuild a capitalism that is both productive and humane, a system where prosperity and dignity coexist. The erosion of social democracy and the moral decay of capitalism. The decades following World War II marked an era of unprecedented prosperity under capitalism. Growth was strong, wages rose, and most importantly, every layer of society shared in the gains. The collective struggle of the Allied nations had forged a spirit of solidarity and national identity. Out of this unity emerged a shared moral consensus, a belief that citizens owed obligations not only to themselves, but also to one another. In the United States, the New Deal laid the foundation for a welfare state that cared for citizens from cradle to grave. The wealthy accepted income tax rates exceeding 80%, remarkably, with little public protest. Across the Atlantic, Britain's National Health Service, NHS, provided free health care for all, supported by both the Labour and Conservative parties. It was a time when economic policy was guided not only by efficiency, but by a sense of mutual responsibility, the moral bedrock of post-war social democracy. Yet beneath this harmony, cracks slowly began to form. As prosperity spread, higher education expanded dramatically. A new class of professionals emerged: technocrats, academics, and knowledge workers who derived their identity not from nation or community, but from expertise and individual achievement. By the 1970s, this educated class had begun to value personal pride and autonomy more than collective belonging. Their politics, both on the left and the right, increasingly celebrated individualism over solidarity. One of the dominant ideologies of the time was utilitarianism, the idea that governments should maximize welfare by redistributing resources to help the least fortunate. But as Collier argues, this shift distorted the moral foundations of post-war communalism. It replaced civic duty with social paternalism, a mindset in which the state assumed moral authority over citizens rather than empowering them to act responsibly within their communities. Meanwhile, the widening income gap between skilled professionals and manual workers deepened social resentment. Working class citizens began to feel that their labor, once respected, was now undervalued and invisible in a system increasingly driven by abstract knowledge and credentials. Many clung to traditional national identities as a way to preserve dignity and meaning in the face of exclusion. Over time, these economic and cultural rifts hollowed out the center of social democracy. Political parties that once spoke for collective fairness began to lose touch with their traditional base. Populist movements filled the void. In the United States, Donald Trump's populist rhetoric resonated with millions who felt left behind by globalization and cultural elitism. Across Europe, traditional social democratic parties, from Germany and Spain to Italy, have seen their electoral support collapse. Even Britain's Labour Party, once the proud defender of working class interests, has veered toward ideological extremism, flirting with neo-Marxist sentiment. Viewed from any angle, the moral landscape of capitalism has shifted dramatically. We now live in an economy that rewards a privileged few while alienating the many. The shared sense of purpose that once held societies together has eroded. Collier's message is clear: nationalism and isolation are not the answer, but neither is moral detachment. What the modern world desperately needs is a renewed sense of patriotism grounded in civic virtue, a loyalty not to tribe or ideology, but to the shared well-being of one's country and community. In short, to rebuild a capitalism that works, we must return to the moral foundations of mutual respect, solidarity, and belonging, the same values that once turned social democracy into the moral compass of a prosperous world. Building a moral capitalism through practical policies and social nurture. Marxist critics have long argued that capitalism prevents shared prosperity, yet history shows that alternative systems have not necessarily lifted workers out of poverty either. In many non capitalist regimes, corruption and inefficiency have proved just as destructive as inequality. As Paul Collier points out, only a society built on decentralized, competitive markets can truly innovate and grow. But those markets must operate within a moral framework. What we need, Collier argues, is a capitalism not driven by greed. Instead of top down social paternalism, he proposes a new concept he calls social maternalism, a state that governs through practical judgment rather than rigid ideology, nurturing a genuine sense of civic belonging and patriotism. Such a system would ensure that citizens of all economic backgrounds are treated with dignity and that moral responsibility is shared among the many, not monopolized by a few. Social maternalism does not dictate what people should value. It empowers the institutions that shape moral character, families, communities, schools, to sustain an unbroken chain of ethical support from childhood to adulthood. In this model, the state becomes not a disciplinarian, but a guardian, helping citizens grow into responsible members of a cohesive society. If this sounds idealistic, Collier insists it is achievable, but only if politics returns to pragmatism. Ideological movements, such as Marxism and libertarianism, he notes, often elevate abstract logic above lived experience. Their values, while noble in theory, are irreconcilable in practice. The fiery, left wing populism of Bernie Sanders and the nationalist rhetoric of Donald Trump illustrate how ideology divides rather than heals. To create a moral form of capitalism that works for everyone, we must abandon blind allegiance to doctrine and focus instead on what tangibly improves lives. Collier draws inspiration from leaders like Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding prime minister. When Lee came to power, the city-state was mired in poverty and corruption. Through a mix of realism, discipline, and zero tolerance for cronyism, he transformed Singapore into one of the world's most prosperous and trustworthy economies within a generation. His success, Collier argues, lay not in ideological purity, but in moral pragmatism, doing what worked, not what conformed to theory. The lesson is clear. Real progress requires practical ethics, not dogma. Leaders must look beyond political tribes and craft policies that reflect the specific moral and cultural fabric of their societies. A truly moral capitalism will not emerge from manifestos. It will grow from countless pragmatic decisions that rebuild trust, fairness, and a sense of shared purpose. And yet, one question remains. What kinds of policies can genuinely restore community values to capitalism? That is the challenge Collier turns to next, the search for practical frameworks that reconnect economics with ethics. Building ethical businesses through purposeful public policy. In the 1970s, Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman famously declared that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. According to his doctrine, the sole duty of a corporation was to maximize shareholder returns. Anything beyond that was a distraction. The welfare of employees, customers, or the broader community, he argued, was not the company's concern. Over the decades, this idea became the ideological backbone of modern corporate capitalism. Boardrooms across the world embraced the shareholder first model. As a result, workers lost their voice in company governance, and few ever shared directly in the profits they helped create. Productivity rose, but wages stagnated. The moral fabric that once tied companies to communities began to unravel. But it wasn't always this way. Until the 1980s, the United Kingdom had a long tradition of mutual companies, businesses owned collectively by their employees or customers rather than by distant shareholders. These organizations, from building societies to insurance firms, were rooted in local trust and reciprocity. However, in 1986, a wave of deregulation and cultural change swept through Britain. Demutualization, the process of converting member owned firms into shareholder corporations, became fashionable, even celebrated. The moral stigma, once attached to stripping ownership from workers and communities, gradually faded. Amid this shift, a few companies resisted and thrived. The most iconic example is John Lewis Partnership, one of the United Kingdom's most successful and admired enterprises. John Lewis is owned not by outside investors, but by a trust that exists solely for the benefit of its employees through a multi tiered structure of local, regional, and national councils. Workers actively participate in decision making. Every employee, regardless of position, receives an annual share of profits and enjoys ownership rights equivalent to those of the company's executives. This model demonstrates that community oriented capitalism can coexist with commercial success. John Lewis's ethical framework, shared ownership, transparency, and collective reward, has produced not only profits, but loyalty, resilience, and a genuine sense of pride among its workforce. As Collier notes, this lesson feels especially urgent today, in an era dominated by corporate giants such as Amazon, Meta, and Google, whose reach extends deep into public life. We urgently need public policies that incentivize moral business behavior. A handful of companies now command the global digital economy, yet their tax contributions remain minimal and their social accountability elusive. One obvious solution is reform through taxation. Global firms that exploit loopholes to avoid paying their fair share must be held accountable. A just tax system, Collier argues, is not an act of punishment. It's a moral contract between business and society. Another step is reforming corporate governance itself. Governments could require companies to include public interest representatives on their boards, people whose responsibility is not to maximize quarterly earnings, but to ensure that corporate actions align with social good. In the United States, a growing movement toward public benefit corporations, PBCs, offers a glimpse of this future. These companies, though still a small fraction of the economy, are legally mandated to balance profit with purpose. Their boards must weigh environmental and social impacts alongside shareholder value. Collier views such models as laboratories of moral capitalism, testing grounds for policies that could reshape capitalism at scale. Of course, change will not come easily. Corporations will inevitably lobby against regulation, resist taxation, and seek loopholes. That is why Collier emphasizes the importance of public participation. Moral capitalism cannot be legislated from above. It must be demanded from below. Consumers, employees, and citizens must hold companies accountable. not only for their profits, but for their principles. Ultimately, ethical capitalism is a partnership between markets and morality, between private ambition and public duty. When guided by thoughtful policy and collective responsibility, business can once again serve society, not the other way around. Social maternalism and the moral renewal of the family. Growing up in a working class family in Sheffield, Paul Collier witnessed firsthand the quiet devastation that family breakdown can cause. His own childhood and that of his cousin, born on the very same day, diverged in heartbreaking contrast. While Collier earned a scholarship to Oxford and embarked on an academic career, his cousin's life took a different turn. The early death of her father shattered her stability. She became a teenage mother, trapped in a cycle of disadvantage that she could never quite escape. For Collier, this story is more than a personal anecdote. It is a mirror of the deeper social fractures weakening modern capitalism. Across much of the West, family instabilities has become increasingly concentrated among low-income and less educated households. In the United States, two-thirds of children born to parents in the bottom half of the educational distribution are raised by a single parent or by no parent at all. These trends, Collier argues, are not merely private tragedies, they are public failures. A society cannot sustain moral capitalism when its most vulnerable citizens grow up without stable homes, guidance, or opportunity. Broken families create broken futures, eroding the sense of belonging that underpins both democracy and economic participation. Even more troubling is how paternalistic welfare states in the West have responded. Instead of reinforcing families, governments have often taken over their responsibilities. Thousands of children are now raised not by relatives, but by the state through foster care systems or residential institutions. In Britain, more than 70,000 children currently live in state care, many cycling through multiple placements with little chance of long-term stability. The paradox is painful. Laws that make it easy to remove children from struggling parents also make adoption extraordinarily difficult. The result is a bureaucratic limbo, children cut off from family without gaining a new one. For Collier, social maternalism offers a more humane path forward. Rather than expanding the state's control over families, it should aim to reconnect and support them. Practical policies, such as tax credits for cohabiting or married couples, can help encourage commitment among young parents and create incentives for stability. Strengthening family bonds, he argues, is not just a private good, but a public one. It fosters happier citizens and healthier communities. Social maternalism, unlike the old paternalism, is not about moral judgment. It is about moral nurture. It recognizes that parents often struggle, not from lack of care, but from lack of support. One example Collier highlights is the Dundee Project in the United Kingdom. This program provides young families with practical help, advice, counseling, and hands-on assistance without the heavy-handed oversight typical of social services. Crucially, the project operates outside the punitive framework of traditional welfare, avoiding the culture of blame that often isolates struggling parents. This separation allows trust to grow between families and social workers. Instead of being monitored and judged, parents are guided and empowered, learning to stand on their own feet. Collier sees in initiatives like Dundee a blueprint for rebuilding the social foundations of moral capitalism. When families are supported rather than fragmented, children grow up with stronger moral compasses, and adults feel a renewed sense of responsibility to their communities. Over time, these families become not just beneficiaries, but defenders of the system itself, voting for policies that sustain the very safety nets that once helped them. The lesson is clear. A moral economy begins at home by nurturing family bonds, fostering dignity, and rebuilding trust between citizens and the state. Social maternalism can restore the emotional infrastructure that capitalism has too long ignored. In Collier's view, the renewal of capitalism will not come from boardrooms or ballot boxes alone. It will begin around the dinner table, where love, stability, and belonging quietly shape the next generation of moral citizens. A moral world demands global solidarity and lean, purpose driven institutions. We have seen what moral capitalism might look like within nations, how governments, companies, and families could be rebuilt on ethical foundations. But what would a moral world look like? Today, more than 65 million people have been forced to leave their homes because of famine, war, and political collapse. Entire populations drift between borders, surviving on the edge of existence. In a truly moral world, wealthy nations, especially those like the United States, blessed with vast resources and stability, would extend solidarity to their struggling neighbors. This solidarity would not take the form of endless aid transfers or guilt driven charity, but of shared opportunity. Rather than simply sending money, rich countries could direct productive work and investment toward regions bordering crisis zones, helping refugees rebuild their lives while stimulating local economies. Global corporations, too, could play a constructive role by relocating certain operations to these regions, bringing employment and dignity to places that have long been defined only by suffering. However, Collier argues that no single nation can create a moral world alone. If inequality within countries has eroded social cohesion, inequality between countries has fractured the global order itself. Closing that gap requires international institutions that embody not only economic cooperation, but also moral accountability. This, he reminds us, was the great lesson of the post World War II era. After witnessing unimaginable destruction, world leaders understood that lasting peace could not be built through isolation. It demanded collective responsibility. Out of that recognition came the institutions that shaped the modern order: the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, founded in 1949 to safeguard the security of 12 member states. But over time, those institutions have grown bloated, fragmented, and often morally adrift. NATO now counts 32 members, yet fewer than 25 meet their defense commitments. The IMF and European Union, though powerful, increasingly resemble quasi-imperial bureaucracies, where a handful of dominant nations dictate terms to weaker members. The ideal of partnership has given way to hierarchy. To reimagine a moral world, Collier proposes a new generation of small, focused international councils, coalitions built not on ideology, but on mutual accountability and problem solving. He points to the G7 as a partial model, but notes its fatal limitation. It excludes emerging giants, such as China and India, whose participation is essential in shaping the future. A truly representative and functional global body, he suggests, might include the United States, the European Union, China, India, Russia, and Japan. Six powers that, though deeply different, together reflect the political, economic, and cultural gravity of the modern world. Such a compact group could act decisively where existing institutions fail. Their conflicting interests would serve as a check on dominance, preventing any single bloc from exploiting global governance for its own gain. More importantly, shared crises, from climate change to water scarcity, will eventually force cooperation, whether nations like it or not. For Collier, the moral imperative is to prepare now, to build lean, trusted, and ethically grounded international institutions that can confront tomorrow's crises with integrity. Waiting until catastrophe strikes will be too late. In the end, his message transcends economics. A moral capitalism cannot survive within immoral borders. The prosperity of one nation is inseparable from the stability of others. And if we wish to preserve our collective humanity, we must learn once again to act not as competitors bound by markets, but as partners bound by conscience. Closing the divides, rebuilding class and place, through shared wealth and shared purpose cities like Sheffield, Lille, and Detroit were once proud symbols of industrial might, engines of prosperity that defined the 20th century. Their foundries, factories, and mills forged not only steel and machinery, but also community, dignity, and a sense of purpose for millions of working families. But by the 1980s, the tide of globalization began to wash that world away. As industries moved offshore in search of cheaper labor, the economic gravity of nations shifted toward metropolitan hubs, London, New York, Paris, and others, where capital, technology, and talent clustered. The very forces that enriched global cities left provincial ones hollowed out. Today, that divide has hardened into a new geography of inequality. The urban elite accumulate wealth simply by virtue of location, a phenomenon economists call the gains of agglomeration. A highly paid lawyer in London, surrounded by affluent clients and world-class infrastructure, can multiply their earnings in ways unimaginable to a lawyer of equal skill in Sheffield. Geography, once a matter of culture and community, has become a currency of privilege. Collier proposes a provocative but pragmatic remedy, a geography-adjusted tax system, taxing high-skilled professionals in global cities at a slightly higher rate than those in struggling regions would help level the playing field, not as punishment, but as a moral correction. In capitalism, place matters. If being in the right city confers economic advantage, then it is only fair that some of that advantage be redistributed to restore balance elsewhere. Yet Collier insists that money alone cannot heal the class divide. Economic redistribution must be accompanied by a redistribution of purpose, by restoring meaning and respect to the working class. Without a sense of dignity, no amount of income will mend the cultural fractures that globalization has deepened. One powerful way to achieve this is through vocational education, a system that honors craft, skill, and contribution as much as intellectual achievement. Germany provides an inspiring example. Its nationwide network of vocational schools blends technical training with professional mentorship. Students apprentice under experts, gaining both hands-on experience and social status as future masters of their trade. By the time they graduate, they are not just employable, they are valued. Society recognizes their work as essential, not secondary. This model contrasts sharply with systems that prioritize academic degrees over practical competence. In Collier's view, a moral capitalism must reimagine merit, valuing excellence in all its forms, whether it comes from a classroom, a workshop, or a care home. Even if the path toward social maternalism and ethical capitalism will not materialize overnight, policies like vocational expansion and fair taxation represent tangible steps toward a more inclusive system. They reflect what Collier calls pragmatic idealism, reform grounded not in ideology, but in results. At its heart, The Future of Capitalism is not merely an economic treatise, it is a moral call to action. In a world where capitalism increasingly rewards the few and neglects the many, Collier urges us to transcend the tired binaries of left and right. Instead, he envisions a practical, ethical capitalism, one that rebuilds trust, restores dignity, and renews community. This moral capitalism would tax global corporations and urban elites who benefit most from economic concentration. It would invest in the people and places left behind. It would nurture purpose within the working class and compassion between nations. Ultimately, Collier's vision is not nostalgic, it is restorative. He asks us to remember that the health of capitalism depends not on the invisible hand of markets, but on the visible heart of society. Only by combining prosperity with morality, efficiency with empathy, and ambition with belonging can humanity chart a future worthy of its promise. Reading The Future of Capitalism felt less like studying an economic theory and more like listening to a wake-up call for humanity. Paul Collier does not simply analyze markets or policies, he holds up a mirror to our collective conscience. His book is a reminder that capitalism, once a force of shared prosperity, has lost its moral compass. I found myself reflecting deeply on his central message that economics without ethics is empty. Collier's idea of social maternalism, a compassionate, pragmatic system that nurtures rather than dictates, moved me profoundly. In a world obsessed with growth, he reminds us that care and connection are also forms of capital. The wealth of a nation, he argues, is not just measured in GDP, but in how its people treat one another, within families, within companies, and across borders. One of the most powerful insights for me was Collier's focus on belonging. He writes with empathy for the forgotten towns and fractured families left behind by globalization. Through his stories, from the broken industrial heartlands of Sheffield and Detroit to the struggling families in Britain's social housing, he paints a vivid picture of a society that has lost not only equality, but also meaning. This book made me think about what it truly means to succeed. If ambition leads us to isolation and wealth creates walls instead of bridges, then perhaps it's time to redefine success itself. Collier's vision of a moral capitalism asks us to use prosperity as a tool to rebuild community, not as a weapon to deepen division. More than anything, The Future of Capitalism reminded me that systems are only as ethical as the people who sustain them. Change does not begin in parliaments or boardrooms. It begins in homes, schools, and workplaces where values are formed and passed on. When we choose empathy over indifference, cooperation over competition, and purpose over profit, we quietly reshape the world. In the end, Collier's message is both sobering and hopeful. He does not romanticize the past, nor does he despair over the present. Instead, he offers a roadmap for moral renewal, one that combines economic realism with ethical responsibility. Capitalism doesn't have to be heartless. Collier reminds us that real progress means building communities that care. If you found this message meaningful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Let's keep this conversation about a better future alive.